Hello. So I'm going to tell you about a few more books I've read, or am reading, but two of them I read in either a day or 2 days and already returned to the library. And those were, as I think I'm going to title this, I've got this and some more. The other two are also like sapphic speculative fiction. They're both kind of in the horror, ghosty, ghosty or cryptid horror-ish categories. Anyway, one of which was My Darling Dreadful Thing by Johanna Van Veen, or Johanna Van Veen. I think she's Dutch, or she's definitely Dutch, and I'm not 100% sure how to pronounce all of those vowels. But that was very good and very interesting. Like, it's when it begins, our main character, the things we know about her are that she has what she calls a spirit companion, which is that other people might call a ghost, but she doesn't like that word. That the spirit companion has been with her for a very long time, and she was in an abusive, shitty situation with her mother, and this spirit companion has been with her since she was about 5. The spirit companion's name is Ruth. And she is a bog body, essentially. And what the main character, Rose, believes that she found, basically her mother was a fraudulent, medium, or did Ouija board spirit channeling stuff, and would make Ruth, her little daughter, hide under the floorboard so she could pull various things, trigger various effects that she wanted for the show she was putting on, essentially. And so this was she has one of her early memories when she's 5 years old, trapped under the floorboards doing this, and she's so scared, and is also bleeding because she's pulling on fine strings, and meets Ruth down there. So she believes that Ruth, the spirit, had been connected to that place for a long time, because her body had been preserved, and then through blood and through giving her the name Ruth, bound them to each other, basically. That's early information. I'm not, telling the whole story. But the other thing we know very early on is that she's suspected of murder and going to be on trial. And so one of the things we have are doctor's notes. And it's very interesting. She's taken out, before too long, she's taken out of this, of her abusive, still channeling, slightly less fraudulently, but not a whole lot, situation with her mother by the other main character, other important character, who also has, a similar experience to some extent, and they have an extremely strong connection, and then a lot of things happen, and it was very intense. That one I read in one day, practically in one sitting. I realized I'd been sitting there for hours and really needed to get up and eat something and go to the bathroom and stuff, and then went back and finished it and ruined my sleep schedule, even more than it just kind of baseline is ruined at the moment. But it was very good, and I recommend it. Again, that was called My Darling Dreadful Thing. I think I'm going to put all the titles and authors in the description as well, in case, like me, it's a lot easier for me to get specific like title information if I see it, because it's so easy to flip at least individual words around in my own head. But yes, the next one that I read over a couple of days is called Patricia Wants to Cuddle, which is a horror. It's a slasher. So I think you need to go in knowing that, and so knowing if you don't like slashers, it's probably not going to be for you, because it is a, relatively lighthearted story where a lot of people die when we get to the action. But I guess the setup is that there's like a bachelorette, or no, a TV show similar to The Bachelor. In one of its near the finale, like I think second to last week. So there are 4 female contestants going to this remote island where there were we learn right near the beginning also that there were some disappearances a few decades ago, and so we get the perspective of those 4 contestants, a woman on the crew, a woman who has been living on the island. I think it's Otter's Island in Washington, which I do not know if it's a real place or not. But near the border with Canada, there are a lot of islands, so I could believe it either way, that it's a real place or that it's plausible to just make one up for a story in that area. But yeah, and so we learn about all of these people, these women and their lives, their very different perspectives on what has brought them to where they are and what their goals are, and then a slasher movie happens, or slasher story happens, and it was very there's some parts about it were very moving and sweet, and it was also yes, dramatic in the kind of silly way that slashers are, which I appreciated a lot. I think I just read a couple more stories from this book, Spirits Abroad by Zen Cho, but I felt like I need to talk about it again because I realized I do still kind of self-edit, so I think I managed when I mentioned this book to talk about like the one story in which our female main character has a crush on a boy and maybe another one where there isn't really any romance involved. Most of these are women who are attracted to women, or women who are in relationships with women, or spirits who appear as women, or women who appear for supernatural reasons as something other than human. Yeah, so there are a lot of, yes, just very moving, very, I can't think of the words I want, but perceptive stories from a variety of angles. And yes, I really highly recommend them. I've learned to read. It's interesting because I really like short stories now, but I, like, as a child, especially, and as a young person, would read largely like to dissociate, like books were largely something that I would just kind of dissociate myself into a story for hours, right? And that is much harder to do with short stories because the story ends and then you can't be in that place anymore because the short story is short. So I've definitely learned to read short stories as an adult, as I've learned to read nonfiction on my own volition and various things. But I really like short stories now, especially, I think, as I said in the last time, I start my day sitting in my easy chair in my bedroom with my tea, and usually the cats snuggle. They have their moods, but usually they snuggle with me, and I read a bit. And a short story is a great way to know that I will have a stopping point, so my brain is less likely to get stuck and just have trouble it makes it easier for me to move on to the next thing, I guess. Short stories are great. And these are some excellent ones. The other book I want to talk about, even though I'm very far from finished with it, but it's a huge book, is this book, The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David Wengrow, which I've heard, which, yeah, it's talked a lot about in some like groups, communities, and not necessarily in others in the last few years, but it's fantastic and also extremely readable. So I've read the first 4 chapters. So for this huge, it's an anthropology, and like David Graeber is also writes about, wrote, he passed away just before this book was finished, as David Wengrow writes, obvious is just a fact, but David Wengrow writes in the acknowledgments, saying that he was writing them on both of their behalf. But yeah, so just briefly, he writes about, David Graeber has written books about economics, especially anarchist economics, and why capitalism is a bad system, especially on the scale that we've allowed it to grow to at this point. So I know the other books of his that are vaguely on my list of books to possibly to read if I have the right brain in the future are Bullshit Jobs and Debt. I think it's like Debt the First 5,000 Years or something. Anyway, but this book is called The Dawn of Everything, where they're just kind of like taking anthropological research and trying to put together, because how a lot of scientific research works, right, is that everybody, to actually be doing research that you can publish, you have to pick out a very small little piece of something you can prove or say something interesting about. Which is part of the reason why scientific journal articles and things are often so inaccessible if it's outside of your field, a field of knowledge that you're comfortable with. You can be very educated in one area, but reading paper in a different discipline, the background knowledge just isn't necessarily presented in those papers. Sometimes they are, and some, depending on the type of journal and who's writing it and different things. But they're saying, like even in anthropology, even in the field, it's difficult to draw or start to put together these kind of big picture ideas about what we've learned about history and what history and the organization of people has looked like over large periods of time. So, which I think is a great service for anyone to provide to the general public. And anyway, so I've read the first 4 chapters, and I'm just looking at their table of contents and gonna tell you what they're called and a little bit about what each of those chapters is. But the first one is called Farewell to Humanity's Childhood, or Why This Is Not a Book About the Origins of Inequality. So something they talk a lot about is how we talk, there are a couple of ideas, and especially a Jean-Jacques Rousseau essay on, something, I don't remember what it's called, but something along the lines of the origins of inequality which postulates this like state of nature, this kind of basically Garden of Eden that humans lived in, and then at some point, it's popular to say with the advent of agriculture or whatever, some people started accumulating more stuff and oppressing other people. And since then, we broke with this state of innocence, state of nature in the past, and we can't go back, or we've never been able to go back, or whatever. And that's an idea that has dominated our kind of all of our conceptions of the world for hundreds of years in the quote unquote West, right? In England and America and some of Western Europe or other English speaking places, kind of, Anyway, and they talk about, they share a lot of research on how there's just no reason to believe that's true. Like, not only did, they talk about how inequality didn't start. Well, so their first chapter is mostly about how that's a bad question, about how asking where did inequality start is a bad question, because that presupposes that there is some kind of natural progression, and that just is not borne out in what we know of current societies or what we can see in the historical record, which we know more and more about all of the time. So inequality does not start with agriculture, and agriculture does not require any form of inequality. And there are, all sorts of different ways that societies have been structured, regardless of kind of how they're economically structured. We can have different ideas. And anyway, the second chapter is called Wicked Liberty, and the subtitle is The Indigenous Critique and the Myth of Progress. So it's, this is largely, I feel like the whole book is kind of developing this one thesis about how there is no, just that progression idea of history is incorrect, and they provide just lots of data and information about different ways that societies have been structured, and evidence that we have of past societies where we can see that something doesn't fit with that, even if we don't know what the whole picture of their life looked like. So the second chapter is largely about the colonization of the United States, and how particularly recorded through French Jesuits, are a lot of critiques that native or indigenous nations here, and in the French Jesuits' case, especially in the Great Lakes region, they ran into very consistent critiques of French and European culture, that it just seemed like, they'd run into a lot of people saying similar things about, it seems like you all are really awful to each other, and that seems like a really bad way to live, and you're awful to each other, and also so other people feel bad, and also you feel bad, and nobody's okay. Why would we want to be like you? What are you talking about? And particularly this one statesman, whose name is Kandiaronk, I think, and who's Wendat, and there's some great quotes there. And also, so one of the things they talk about is how it is people call it settlers, immigrants from Europe and England didn't really think of themselves as American, instead of thinking of themselves as English but in a colony, or Dutch but in a colony, or whatever. They started thinking of themselves as American when they started to integrate some of these indigenous critiques of European society into their self-concept, right? So these indigenous nations had a huge impact on us, on how we defined our society, and they argue, they show there's strong evidence that basically is what led to the the Enlightenment in Europe, the indigenous critique that was presented here to settlers and by a variety of people. There are a few individuals, but also there's much more in at multiple societies, maybe not every society here, but multiple of the societies that were encountered, where people were just very used to talking about how things should work and why something should be having. People were used to having a voice in whether or not they should do something, whether or not they should be part of something, and whether or not they were willing to do certain work or whatever. So there was not the same like top-down obedience and control in many aspects of public life, which also meant that Indigenous Americans were much better at reasoning and speaking, because that was part of daily life and part of society, is that everybody's voice is important, and so everybody's using them. Okay, there's a lot of good stuff. But, okay, so the third, I guess, is called Unfreezing the Ice Age, and then In and Out of Chains, the Protean Possibilities of Human Politics. And that's kind of just a lot of information about especially different historical sites that we have that show very different, you can think of them as like examples that don't fit our overall kind of narrative of human history that you're used to. Sorry, there's a bug. Including, I know one of them that I'm going to look into some more is Poverty Point in Louisiana. And a lot of them, so thinking about them for myself, there is this feeling, I've been, doing witchy stuff for close to a decade, which mostly just means kind of like intentionally building my own identity and my own relationship with the world, I guess, for me. And one of the things that you run into is that there are a lot of even, people writing in the Americas, when we reach for stories about ancient connections to the supernatural world, are, like things that come up a lot are like the chalk or the shell, large, like cliff, what do I want to call them? Like outlines, like these huge structures that are like shapes of animals or birds in shell, I think in Wales. But they're all these, like, generally just we're much more familiar with what that looks like in other places, even though it also exists here in the U.S. It just doesn't, fit into our narrative of history. So if we're aware of it at all, my feeling is that it's much easier to dismiss it as one weird example, or like just have it be an example that doesn't really fit, so you don't talk about it. Anyway, so Poverty Point is this huge structure where clearly a lot of people gathered thousands of years ago, but also there's no evidence of agriculture, certainly not there. So, and yeah, their discussion is fascinating, and it's relatively brief. I'm sure there's a lot more out there, so I'm going to be looking more for that. And then the fourth chapter is Free People, the Origin of Cultures, and the Advent of Private Property, which is maybe where the example I was just talking about is from. But yeah, so I won't rehash that, but they just have a lot of, they'll present a way that, I guess also I'll just show you, they have a lot of these like section titles in just so like periodically throughout a chapter, like every few pages of kind of a section title. So this one says, why the real question is not what are the origins of social inequality, but how did we get stuck, which are very like conversational and also help you keep track of the larger point they're trying to make. and keeps them focused, I'm sure, while they were writing. Anyway, so, oh, and I double checked before I got on, before I started this. I couldn't find this book in ebook or audiobook on either of the library apps that I use. I was gifted this copy, so thank you, Mom. But I did find there are, which fitting with the politics of these authors, there are a ton of, if you search the Dawn of Everything PDF, there are a ton of PDF versions, and I find it extremely readable if you're at all interested, or if there's a specific aspect of history or their economics that you hear this referred to. I highly recommend downloading a PDF and, you know, just search for whatever words, concept, like, are connected to what you're interested in, and see if there's a section. Because they do a good job of staying grounded, so not assuming that you have just read, you know, however many hundreds or thousands of words they've written before this. You know, they're not assuming you have kept it all in your mind or read it at all, and stating, like, it's readable, like it's they're stating what they're trying to say clearly, and citing a lot of interesting sources. And yeah, I recommend it. So thank you, and I'll see you again soon.